So Canada just made a potato move that hit American fast food supply chains harder than any trade measure in the history of the continental food industry. Not through tariffs on imports, not through taxes on commerce, not through any mechanism the World Trade Organization has jurisdiction over, or the United States Trade Representative can challenge through any bilateral forum. Through a coordinated export policy restructuring combined with commercial prioritization decisions by McCain Foods and Cavendish Farms, the two largest frozen potato processors on Earth, that redirected Canadian potato supply away from American fast food chains and toward European, Asian, and domestic Canadian buyers effective immediately. With supply contract renegotiations that American corporate procurement departments are now fighting through in conditions their internal systems have never been built to handle. The timing was surgical, coordinated to arrive at the exact moment Canadian potato harvest determines annual supply allocation. When American fast food chains discover their access to the coming year's French fry inventory on terms their business models have never confronted. Within 48 hours, McDonald's corporate issued internal supply alerts to its franchisee network. Wendy's projected menu price adjustments for multiple product lines. Burger King paused a limited-time offering that required specialty potato varieties only Canadian producers supply at commercial scale. Chick-fil-A's waffle fry supply chain entered emergency assessment. Grocery freezer brands, including Ore-Ida, owned by Kraft Heinz, which is a major Berkshire Hathaway portfolio holding, warned distributors of near-term availability constraints. And American consumers, who have eaten the same French fries their entire lives, began receiving the first signals that something about the most iconic product in American fast food was about to change in ways that corporate communications teams have no framework for explaining. Warren Buffett, whose Berkshire Hathaway portfolio includes some of the most iconic consumer brands in American history, and whose investment philosophy is built around 70 years of understanding what makes consumer franchises durable, called the move the most precisely targeted strike against American consumer brand equity he had observed in 5 decades of studying the food industry, and then explained why the specific vulnerability Canada exploited cannot be engineered around within any time frame that matters for this marketing year. But it's what Carney said when he announced the policy from a potato farm on Prince Edward Island. 10 words delivered with the soil of the largest potato-producing region in North America visible beneath his feet that tells you this isn't a commodity dispute. This is a demonstration that American consumer culture runs on Canadian agricultural foundations American policy never guaranteed and never controlled. When you hear exactly what the policy changes, which fast food chains are most exposed and why, what this means for the Russet Burbank potato variety that McDonald's specifications were literally engineered around, and what Buffett says about the category of consumer brand vulnerability Canada just exposed, you'll understand why this isn't a trade story. This is the moment the drive-through window became the front line of continental economic power, and hitting subscribe matters because the menu changes are already arriving at the restaurants closest to where you live. Let me walk you through exactly what Canada did, because the architecture of the move reveals a level of sophistication that caught American corporate procurement departments completely unprepared. The policy framework was announced by Carney under the name Canadian Agricultural Priority Export Framework federal legislation, establishing tiered export allocation for critical Canadian agricultural products during designated strategic periods. The legal grounding was deliberately positioned in Canadian food security and national economic interest, not in trade policy or bilateral relations, which removes every legal handle American regulators would normally use to challenge it at the World Trade Organization or under USMCA provisions. The framework designates certain agricultural categories, potatoes prominent among them, as subject to priority allocation that favors Canadian domestic processors, long-term international contract partners, and buyers whose commercial relationships demonstrate strategic value to Canadian economic interest over multi-year horizons. Every sentence in the legislation was reviewed by Canadian International Trade Council to ensure that the policy presented as routine domestic agricultural management could not be successfully reinterpreted as coordinated trade retaliation. The result was a sovereign policy action that American regulators have no jurisdiction to challenge and no mechanism to reverse. The commercial dimension arrived within 72 hours of the policy announcement and was more consequential than the legislation itself. McCain Foods, the largest frozen French fry producer on Earth, Canadian headquartered in New Brunswick, operating plants across Canada, the United States, Europe, and Asia, released a revised customer prioritization framework that reassigns supply allocation based on contract terms, customer relationship value, and strategic geographic positioning. Cavendish Farms, Prince Edward Island-based, the second largest frozen potato processor in North America and a major supplier to U.S. fast food chains, released a parallel framework within the same week. Both companies framed their announcements as routine business decisions reflecting shareholder value optimization and operational efficiency, language that removes any trade action framing that could trigger USMCA dispute mechanisms. But the timing of the two announcements, the parallel framing, and the fact that Transport Canada had convened private meetings with both companies' executive leadership in the preceding weeks made the coordination visible to anyone reading the industry press. The practical effect was that American fast food customers who had operated for decades under informal understandings about supply priority, contract pricing, and capacity allocation discovered that those understandings no longer applied at the exact moment annual procurement cycles were closing. The specific changes landed across 4 distinct dimensions that together reconstructed the economics of the American fast food potato supply chain. Export priority restructuring shifted Canadian seed potatoes exports and frozen French fry exports toward Canadian growers, European markets, and Asian buyers on long-term contracts. Processing capacity allocation redirected McCain and Cavendish Canadian plant capacity toward Canadian domestic supply, European export commitments, and Asian market development, moving American fast food customers down the priority queue during scheduled production windows. Rate and term restructuring introduced new contract pricing that American procurement departments described as fundamentally uncompetitive with prior arrangements with price premiums of 15 to 25% across multiple product categories. And the timing announced weeks before American fast food chains' complete annual supply planning created a situation in which American companies had to choose between accepting the new terms immediately or finding alternative suppliers that did not exist at the varieties, volumes, or specifications their business models require. But the devastating part of Canada's move is not the policy architecture. It is the specific fast food chains and grocery brands now facing supply disruptions at a scale their corporate systems have never had to manage. And the exposure maps almost perfectly onto the most iconic American consumer brands of the past half-century. McDonald's carries the deepest vulnerability. The chain uses approximately 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually to produce the French fries that are arguably the single most recognized consumer food product on the planet. And the variety that McDonald's specifications are built around, Russet Burbank, is produced at McDonald's specification quality primarily in Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and certain regions of Manitoba and Alberta. The French fry is not a generic product in McDonald's business model. It is a specific cooking time, a specific internal texture, a specific caramelization profile, and a specific aftertaste that customers 50 years of brand loyalty around. And the specifications are engineered for the starch content and sugar profile of Russet Burbank grown in Canadian soil conditions. Any supply disruption forces McDonald's into a choice no fast food chain wants to make: variety substitution that changes the product and risks customer loyalty, or reduced availability that cuts revenue in the category that delivers the highest margins on the menu. Wendy's exposure runs through its natural cut skin-on French fry program, which requires specific potato sizes and quality specifications
That Canadian producers supply at scale and that American regions cannot consistently match in the volumes needed.
Burger King's frozen French fry supply has been increasingly concentrated through McCain manufacturing over the past decade, and the chain's recent supply chain restructuring had expanded rather than reduced Canadian dependency. Chick-fil-A's waffle fry, a distinctive product that has become a brand signature, requires specialty cuts that only a limited number of processing facilities are equipped to produce, and McCain and Cavendish together operate the majority of that specialized capacity. Canadian-owned fast food chains operating in the United States, including Tim Hortons and A&W, hold preferential supply access that creates an ironic competitive dimension. Canadian brands operating on American soil receiving priority over American brands competing in the same market. Every major fast food chain and every grocery freezer brand with significant volume depends at some level on Canadian processing capacity that is now allocated according to Canadian strategic priorities rather than American procurement convenience. The grocery aisle consequences compound the restaurant industry impact. Ore-Ida, the dominant frozen potato brand in American supermarkets and a subsidiary of Kraft Heinz, which is a significant Berkshire Hathaway holding, depends on McCain manufacturing capacity for a substantial portion of its production. Private label grocery brands across every major retail chain, from Kroger to Walmart, source frozen potato products through McCain or Cavendish manufacturing. Sysco and U.S. Foods, the two dominant food service distributors, supply independent restaurants and institutional buyers with Canadian processed potato products at volumes that cannot quickly replace. Hotel and institutional food service, hospitals, schools, corporate cafeterias, stadium concessions, operates on procurement contracts that assume Canadian supply availability. The cascade from Canadian harvest decision to American grocery shelf, restaurant menu, and institutional kitchen runs through a supply chain that took 4 decades to build and that cannot be restructured in the time frame between now and this coming year's fast food marketing cycle. And the reaction across corporate America and in Washington confirmed something the administration had not anticipated. There is no available policy response to a situation where two private companies adjust their customer priorities in ways American antitrust law not only permits but would consider standard business practice. Trump's public response came at a rally in Ohio where he was asked about rising fast food prices by a local reporter. His answer blamed Canada in language that his own Commerce Department immediately contradicted in a statement released that evening, threatened to investigate McCain and Cavendish despite neither company having violated any American law, and demanded that American fast food chains just buy American potatoes, in a statement that revealed misunderstanding of variety specifications, processing capacity constraints, and the multi-year cycles that determine seed potato availability. Truth Social posts in the following days called for potato tariffs that trade lawyers and agricultural economists immediately pointed out would raise American fast food costs rather than Canadian ones, because the tariff would be paid by American importers and passed through to American consumers. The response was improvised, the threats were empty, and the administration's own agencies began contradicting the president's statements within the same news cycle. Corporate America scrambled behind closed doors at a scale the industry press had not seen since the early pandemic. McDonald's corporate convened emergency supply chain meetings that continued for 3 consecutive days. CEO-level calls took place between Wendy's, Burger King, Yum! Brands, and Restaurant Brands International, exploring whether collective response options existed. They did not. Procurement teams at Kraft Heinz, Conagra, Lamb Weston Holdings, and Simplot assessed exposure and concluded that domestic American production could not absorb the redirected demand at the varieties, volumes, or specifications required within any meaningful time frame. Food service distributor leadership briefings warned institutional buyers of likely supply variability across the coming year, and every corporate assessment arrived at the same fundamental recognition. The American fast food industry had built its brand equity, menu economics, and customer loyalty on a supply foundation that was always Canadian, that had been Canadian for half a century, and that no amount of procurement reorganization could rebuild on domestic sources within any time frame that would preserve the current business cycle. The USDA emergency analysis arrived within the week and delivered a conclusion that no senior agricultural official wanted to put in writing. American potato production capacity existed, but at different variety profiles, concentrated in Idaho, Washington, and North Dakota, serving different processing networks and unable to quickly expand to replace Canadian supply at the specifications required. The bottleneck was not growing capacity, it was processing capacity, because frozen French fry production requires specialized plant configurations that take 2 to 4 years to build and hundreds of millions of dollars per facility to commission. The Idaho governor, whose state is more identified with potatoes than any other in America, held a press conference with the Idaho Potato Commission and delivered the honest admission that Idaho, even Idaho, could not replace Canadian supply to American fast food chains within any meaningful time frame for this marketing year or the next one. One senior food industry executive quoted the trade press in a conversation the source permitted for attribution, captured the moment with the kind of stark honesty that Washington political communications rarely produces. "We built the American fast food industry on Canadian potatoes and never told the country. Now the country is about to find out." And then Carney did something that turned what had been a commercial supply story into a declaration about the foundations of continental consumer culture. The setting was a potato farm in central Prince Edward Island. 3 generations of the family that owned the farm standing alongside the Prime Minister, the harvest equipment running in the distance, and the red soil that grows 1 in every 3 French fries eaten in North America visible in every frame the cameras captured. The CEOs of McCain Foods and Cavendish Farms stood behind Carney in the wide shot. The coordination between Canadian government policy and Canadian private industry visible in the arrangement of the people on the farm. The provincial premiers of PEI, New Brunswick, Manitoba, and Alberta were present. Every major Canadian potato-producing province represented on the same farm on the same day. The International Press Corps had been flown in on government charter, and the live stream that Canadian Communications had prepared weeks in advance reached agricultural trading floors, consumer brand research divisions, and food industry analysts on 4 continents within minutes of its start. Carney began by acknowledging the soil and the farmers, the multi-generational Canadian agricultural tradition, the specific families and specific provinces that had built the potato industry that now supplied the majority of North American frozen French fries. He transitioned to the policy framework with the measured precision that has defined his public voice through every previous confrontation: sovereign agricultural priority, strategic export allocation, national food security, the specific legal grounding that placed the framework beyond any American regulatory reach. Then he addressed the American fast food industry and American consumers directly in a tone that was not combative but was unmistakably final. I want to speak for a moment to the American fast food industry and to the American consumers who have enjoyed the products of Canadian agricultural labor for decades without the relationship being fully acknowledged. Canada has been proud to supply the potatoes that became the French fries in drive-through windows from Maine to California, from Minnesota to Texas. That supply relationship has been a gift of Canadian soil, Canadian genetics, Canadian farmers, Canadian processing capacity, and Canadian commercial cooperation. But gifts are not guarantees, and the Canadian government, charged with stewarding Canadian agricultural resources on behalf of the Canadian people, has an obligation to ensure that Canadian supply serves Canadian strategic interests first, and to allocate beyond that obligation according to which international relationships are productive, respectful, and worth preserving. Then he looked directly into the cameras, the soil visible beneath his feet, the harvest running in the background, and spoke the 10 words that are now the caption on every photograph, the lead of every analysis, and the quote in every consumer brand research report that will be published for the next decade. Every French fry in America begins in Canadian soil. The silence in the moment held for longer than American political speechwriting would have scripted. The phrase was trending globally within 4 minutes. Within the hour, it appeared on the front pages of the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, Bloomberg, and every major business and agricultural publication in Europe and Asia. Food industry analysts cited the line as the new framing for every research report on North American consumer brand supply chain risk. And within 24 hours, the line had become the basis for thousands of social media posts, news graphics, and consumer conversations that brought the supply chain reality into the awareness of American consumers who had never considered where their French fries came from. But what Canada's potato move exposed is something most Americans have never considered about the food on their plates. And the revelation that followed in the days after Carney's farm appearance transformed public understanding in ways that will outlast the immediate crisis. The variety dependency begins with Russet Burbank, the dominant variety for frozen French fry production, developed over generations to produce the specific texture, starch content, and sugar profile that defines the commercial French fry experience. Russet Burbank, grown in Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick, produces results that American growing regions cannot consistently match because the specific combination of red iron-rich soil, maritime climate, summer temperature profiles, and water availability in the Canadian maritime provinces creates growing conditions that potato genetics respond to in ways that cannot be replicated through agricultural technique or irrigation management. American Russet Burbank production exists in Idaho, Washington, and certain areas of the Columbia Basin, but produces a different commercial profile acceptable for many uses, but not identical to McDonald's specifications or to the quality profile that Canadian-grown Russet Burbank delivers for premium frozen French fry applications. The difference sounds minor and is in fact measured in small percentage variations of starch, sugar, and moisture content, but those small percentages are the entire difference between the French fry customers recognize and a substitute they will taste immediately. The genetic foundation compounds the variety dependency in ways that most food industry analysts have not publicly discussed. Canadian seed potato production, the certified disease-free genetic stock that serves as the starting point for commercial potato growing, supplies a substantial share of the North American seed potato market. The Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick seed potato programs have been protected from disease transmission through some of the most rigorous certification protocols in the world, and the resulting seed stock is the genetic foundation that commercial growers across North America rely on to begin each year's crop. Disruption at the seed potato level does not produce a single-year effect. It compounds across multiple years because the seed-to-commercial cycle takes multiple growing seasons, and any interruption in seed potato availability restricts commercial potato production years into the future. American seed potato programs exist, but operate at smaller scale, and would require years of expansion to replace Canadian genetic supply at the volumes required for continental commercial production. The processing capacity constraint may be the most decisive factor in why the disruption cannot be quickly resolved. McCain Foods' Canadian plants and Cavendish Farms processing facilities operate specialized frozen French fry production lines that represent hundreds of millions of dollars of capital investment each and that took years to commission. American processing capacity exists, Lamb Weston, Simplot, McCain's U.S. operations, but runs at full utilization with committed contracts that cannot be reallocated to replace redirected Canadian volume without disrupting existing customer relationships. Adding new processing capacity to replace what Canadian policy has now reallocated would require 2 to 4 years of construction per facility, regulatory approvals in multiple jurisdictions, and capital commitments measured in billions of dollars across the industry. The frozen French fry cold chain that connects Canadian processing plants to American distribution centers to individual restaurant freezers took 4 decades to build. Involves integrated logistics agreements, specialized trucking fleets, cold storage infrastructure, and the kind of operational coordination that cannot be reconstructed on alternative geographic foundations in the time frame that matters for the current business cycle. And then Warren Buffett addressed the dimension of the crisis that no other analyst had fully articulated, the intersection of supply chain dependency and consumer brand equity, which is the territory Warren Buffett has spent 70 years mapping more thoroughly than any investor in history. Berkshire Hathaway's portfolio includes holdings in Kraft Heinz, in See's Candies, in Coca-Cola, in Dairy Queen, and in a range of consumer brand companies whose durability depends on the same principles Buffett identified when he first wrote about competitive moats decades ago. His Kraft Heinz position in particular provides direct exposure to the Ore-Ida brand and to the frozen potato products that depend on McCain processing capacity, which makes his analysis not disinterested commentary, but the assessment of an investor whose own portfolio is directly affected by the supply chain disruption he is analyzing. His response to the Canadian move was therefore both intellectually precise and commercially grounded, and the framework he laid out will be quoted in consumer brand research divisions for the next generation. In 70 years of studying consumer brands, Buffett began, I have learned that the strongest brands are the ones that customers identify not with a product category, but with a specific product experience. A McDonald's French fry is not a category. It is a specific taste, a specific texture, a specific aftertaste, and a specific set of expectations that customers have built around a specific supply chain, producing a specific result from a specific agricultural input. That specificity is the brand's moat. It is what protects McDonald's from commodity fast food competition. It is what gives the brand pricing power, customer loyalty, and the decades of compounding brand equity that make McDonald's one of the most valuable consumer franchises in the history of American commerce. But that same specificity is also the brand's vulnerability, because the moment the supply chain changes, the product changes. And the moment the product changes, the customer relationship that took decades to build can unravel in weeks or months rather than years. He applied the principle to the specific situation with the precision of someone who had personally evaluated the competitive position. What Canada has done is precisely targeted at this vulnerability across the entire American fast food industry. Canada has not, and the moment the product changes, the customer relationship that took decades to build can unravel in weeks or months rather than years. He applied the principle to the specific situation with the precision of someone who had personally evaluated the competitive position. What Canada has done is precisely targeted at this vulnerability across the entire American fast food industry. Canada has not attacked American fast food revenue. Canada has not attacked American consumer spending or American franchise operations or American tax collections. Canada has attacked the specific agricultural foundation that American fast food brand equity is built on. The variety, the genetics, the growing conditions, and the processing capacity that together produce the specific product that customers associate with specific brands. Substitution is not an engineering problem that can be solved with capital investment in alternative supply. It is a taste problem, and taste is not a supply chain variable. Taste is what the brand I is. When you change the taste, you change the brand, and you cannot protect a brand whose defining characteristic is a taste you no longer control. The historical pattern Buffett drew reached across a century of consumer brand history. I have watched this pattern play out in consumer brands for decades, and the lesson is always consistent. Coca-Cola changed its formula in 1985 and faced a customer revolt that nearly broke one of the strongest brands in the history of American commerce. The company spent years and billions of dollars recovering from a 3-month product experiment. McDonald's changed its French fry formulation in 1990, moving away from beef tallow frying in response to health advocacy pressure, and faced measurable customer dissatisfaction that took nearly a decade to fully recover from. Every case in my memory shows the same lesson. Specificity in consumer brand experience is both the moat and the vulnerability. And when the specificity is controlled by someone other than the brand owner, the moat becomes a trap. American fast food companies are about to discover this lesson at industry scale and real time during a period when they also face inflation pressure, labor cost increases, and competitive pressure from grocery meal replacement and independent restaurant competitors. The timing could not be worse, and the timing was not chosen by them. His closing landed with the deceptive simplicity that has defined his public voice for decades. McDonald's franchise operators in multiple markets received internal communications warning of supply variability across French fry inventory and authorizing temporary substitutions that franchise operations manuals had never previously permitted. Wendy's announced menu price increases on premium French fry products and paused the rollout of 2 limited-time menu items that had been scheduled for the coming quarter. Burger King reformulated a seasonal promotion that had required specialty potato varieties no longer available at commercial volumes. Chick-fil-A began quiet conversations with franchise operators about potential waffle fry availability adjustments during peak demand periods. And every national fast food chain issued investor communications warning of margin pressure in the French fry category that Wall Street analysts immediately translated into revised earnings projections for the full fiscal year. The McDonald's moment arrived with the kind of visibility that only one of the most iconic brands in American commerce can produce. The chain CEO held an unscheduled investor call to reassure markets about supply stability, which had the paradoxical effect of confirming to everyone that supply stability was at risk. Analysts' downgrades of McDonald's stock followed within 48 hours, with 3 major investment banks revising 12-month price targets downward by between 4 and 7%. Grocery store Impact followed the same week. Ore-Ida frozen potato products began showing availability gaps at major retail chains in multiple states. Private label frozen potato inventory ran short at Kroger, Albertsons, and Walmart distribution centers, forcing category managers to reshuffle shelf allocations and mark up available products to manage demand. Consumer visible shortages appeared first in the northeastern and upper Midwest markets closest to the Canadian supply chain and spread outward across the country within 10 days of the initial announcement. The restaurant industry impact extended far beyond the major national chains. Independent restaurants sourcing through Sysco and U.S. Foods received allocation notices reducing their frozen potato availability. Regional chains without the procurement scale of national brands faced immediate supply shortages they could not negotiate around. Food service distributors to hospitals, schools, and corporate cafeterias issued availability warnings. Menu reprinting costs, reformulation expenses, and customer communication adjustments cascaded through thousands of small business operations that had never previously had reason to think about where their French fries came from. Stock market reaction reflected the scale of the exposure. McDonald's stock fell. Yum! Brands fell. Restaurant Brands International, the parent of Burger King and Tim Hortons, experienced mixed movement as Tim Hortons' Canadian supply advantage offset Burger King's exposure. Kraft Heinz fell on Ore-Ida exposure concerns. Lamb Weston Holdings, the American frozen potato processor most positioned to capture redirected demand, rose sharply. But the gains were modest compared to the broader sector losses because analysts recognized that Lamb Weston could not quickly expand to replace redirected Canadian volume. But the fallout did not stay at the drive-through window. It spread into American politics, American business, and American consumer culture in ways the administration had not modeled and could not contain, because the political geography of American fast food consumption is the political geography of the administration's electoral base. Corporate America turned on the administration with a speed that caught Washington by surprise. Fast food CEOs who had maintained careful silence through every previous trade confrontation made rare public statements calling for immediate diplomatic resolution with Canada. The National Restaurant Association, which represents hundreds of thousands of independent restaurant operators, issued a statement describing the situation as a crisis of American consumer brand supply that requires immediate executive action to resolve. Franchise owner associations, representing the small business operators who actually run the thousands of fast food restaurants in every American town, began coordinated pressure campaigns on congressional offices in every state. The political weight of franchise operators in local politics is substantial and had been broadly supportive of the current administration, and the reversal of that support created pressure that congressional Republicans could not ignore. Political fractures opened in states where fast food corporate headquarters or major franchise concentrations created immediate economic exposure. The governor of Illinois, home state of McDonald's global headquarters, held a press conference demanding federal action to restore Canadian supply relationships. The governor of Kentucky, home to Yum! Brands and to a massive franchise operator base, issued a similar statement. The governor of Idaho, caught between defending American potato production and acknowledging that Idaho could not replace Canadian supply, delivered a carefully worded statement that managed to avoid blaming Canada while making clear that federal trade posture had produced outcomes harmful to American consumers. Republican senators from states with major fast food corporate operations began distancing themselves from the administration's handling of the Canadian relationship. The Senate Agriculture Committee announced hearings into the supply chain crisis, and the House Small Business Committee opened a parallel inquiry into franchise operator impact. The political infrastructure of the administration's agricultural and small business coalition was fracturing in public, and the fractures mapped almost exactly onto the electoral coalitions the administration needed for the coming cycle. Consumer backlash accelerated as menu changes became visible in individual American neighborhoods. Polling conducted within 2 weeks of the Canadian announcement showed that 63% of Americans were aware of the fast food supply disruption, and that 58% attributed the disruption to the administration's trade confrontation with Canada. Social media amplification of menu changes, price increases, and supply shortages at local restaurants drove the awareness curve higher than any political communication had achieved in previous trade disputes. The demographic most exposed to daily fast food consumption, working class, rural, and suburban voters, was the same demographic that had delivered the administration's electoral margin in the previous cycle. And the cumulative pressure at the household budget level produced polling movement that campaign strategists had not predicted. International realignment followed the domestic political pressure. European fast food markets captured Canadian supply on preferential terms. Asian fast food chains benefited from improved Canadian access. Australian and European potato producers positioned to capture American market share in adjacent product categories. The compound effect arriving on top of previous Canadian confrontations involving food strategy, water sovereignty, rail infrastructure, and port access made clear to American observers that the series of Canadian actions represented a sustained strategic repositioning rather than isolated disputes. The pattern was becoming impossible to deny, so here's where we stand. Canada executed a coordinated policy and commercial action that redirected potato supply away from American fast food chains, disrupted supply chains that the American consumer brand industry built over 50 years, and exposed the dependency of some of the most iconic brands in American business on Canadian agricultural foundations that American policy never controlled. McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger King, Chick-fil-A, and every grocery freezer brand that depends on McCain or Cavendish processing capacity now face supply restructuring at the exact moment annual planning cycles become irreversible. American consumers are experiencing the changes at the drive-thru window and the grocery aisle and at the checkout counter. Franchise operators in every state are pressuring their elected officials for resolution. Stock markets are repricing consumer brand equity across the fast food sector, and the administration's own electoral coalition is fracturing under consumer pressure that federal policy cannot relieve. Mark Carney stood on a Prince Edward Island potato farm with the CEOs of McCain Foods and Cavendish Farms behind him, the soil that grows 1 in every 3 French fries eaten in North America under his feet, and spoke 10 words that are now the caption on every photograph, the lead of every analysis, and the quote in every consumer brand research report that will be published for the next decade. Every French fry in America begins in Canadian soil. And Warren Buffett, who has spent 70 years studying what makes consumer brands durable, explained why the damage to American fast food brand equity will be absorbed into permanently lower valuations, because you cannot build a brand on someone else's soil and expect the soil to remain yours. And because the franchise is not the building or the logo, but the taste, and the taste is grown somewhere else, can American consumer brands rebuild their supply foundations on domestic sources that do not exist at the variety, volume, or specifications required? Can brand equity built on specific product experience survive the substitutions that are now unavoidable? Can the franchise operators of tens of thousands of American fast food restaurants maintain the customer loyalty and operational margins their businesses depend on while their supply costs rise and their product quality varies? And the question that every American who has eaten a French fry in the past week should be asking, because the answer is already arriving in receipts at the drive-thru. What happens to the taste of American consumer culture when the foundation underneath it, the soil, the genetics, the processing capacity, the supply chain, belongs to a nation your own government just tried to pressure? And that nation chose to press its advantage at the exact moment the pressure would show up at the drive-thru window in your own neighborhood. Trump tried to pressure Canada on trade through tariffs and political posture. Instead, Canada exposed that American fast food, the consumer culture itself, runs on Canadian soil. He tried to demonstrate American economic dominance over a smaller trading partner through confrontational diplomacy. Instead, he demonstrated that the most iconic products of American consumer culture, the brands that define the experience of eating out in America, are built on agricultural foundations American policy cannot guarantee and never controlled. He tried to make Carney back down through threats that assumed American leverage over the bilateral relationship. Instead, he gave Carney the moment to stand on Canadian soil with the CEOs of the companies that produce most of North America's French fries behind him and speak 10 words that every American who has ever eaten at a fast food restaurant now understands with perfect and permanent clarity. Every French fry in America begins in Canadian soil.